Welcome back to your Wednesday Buckeye Talk. From cleveland.com, Doug Lesmerises, Nathan Baird, Stephen Means, part 2 of the 2023 depth chart preview. Well, the thing about it is the depth charts no longer exist for Ohio State, so the depth charts really all year only exist in the mind of Nathan Baird, who puts one together every week based on our eyeballs and our knowledge. And so if you're putting one together right now, Nathan, then that's the official depth chart, because Ohio State doesn't do depth charts anymore. It still boggles my mind. When Jim Harbaugh stopped doing depth charts, it was like he had ripped out the soul of college football. Then like the next year, Ohio State was like, we're not doing it either. It's like, what are you going to do? So I still want to do a survey sometime of who doesn't do depth charts, because I just think it's silly. So we're doing it here. Last podcast on Tuesday, we went through the projected depth chart for the Buckeyes this fall on the offensive side of the ball. We're going to do it on the defensive side of the ball today, and we will continue to reference the podcast from early July 2021 when we asked the question and perhaps gave the answer. Will Ohio State in 2023 be one of the greatest teams in college football history? Very yes, possibly. And I was listening back to the defensive part of that podcast, and I was reminded, gentlemen, of what I think is probably maybe the most underrated Bill Murray movie. It's called Quick Change, and Bill Murray robs a bank dressed as a clown. I don't think that gives anything away. So there are parts. It is probably the movie in our home with the most lines that we say. But one of them I said out loud to myself after listening to the defensive side of the ball depth chart projection from July 2021, Nathan. And one of those lines is, they rob the bank, and then things go a little bit haywire, and Bill Murray says, this was not the plan. So I listened to what we thought the defense in 2023 was going to be and what we now think the defense in 2023 is going to be, and it does not match up, Nathan. Are you surprised to hear that, or are you like, no, I didn't know. I get it.
No, I didn't listen back yet, but we were talking about this before the pod, and I was like, did Steele Chambers' name come up? A guy who we thought was still a running back in July 2021 and still was actually, I think, a running back technically in early July of 2021 before he became what he is now, which is the returning starter at will linebacker for a team that wants to win a national championship. And, this is the one where, in similar to our conversation about the offensive line, and again, I haven't looked back. I'm going to be curious to know what we laid out for the corners and the whole secondary in July of 2021, because we probably weren't anticipating some things that didn't work out. But we also didn't anticipate Jim Knowles being the defensive coordinator. That's the other thing that has changed here is this is not we were picking a lineup for a defense that didn't exist to some extent. It's only small wrinkles, but I think the stamp that Jim Knowles put on this last year and the way he used some personnel last year is definitely going to influence how we're looking at this now as opposed to how we looked at it in July of 2021.
Yeah, we're having conversations about picking one safety to be on the field in July 2021, where there's a lot of bullet talk. And there was a lot of talk about a particular guy that there are some quotes that I pulled out from what we said back then. But let's start on the defensive line when we think about projecting this defense for 2023. And Stephen, we'll start with the guys that we started with back then. And they were two guys who were the second and third highest defensive recruits in the class of 2021, jt-tuimoloau and jack-sawyer. Only Corey Foreman was a higher rated defensive player in that class. And Stephen, we said things, or maybe I'm going to we a lot when maybe it's I. But listen, we're all in this together. And who's going to go back and listen and say like, who said that ridiculous thing? We as a podcast said ridiculous things. I think someone, perhaps me, said they could be the two best defensive players in college football by 2023. jt-tuimoloau and jack-sawyer, because that's where they were as recruits at that level. And so we also were talking about, as we got to other positions, well, do they have depth here? What do they have here? the backups we were talking about at defensive end in July of 2021 were Jacoby Cowan and Darian Henry Young, and also like somebody who shows up in a later recruiting class. So those are two guys that are already gone. But the thing we said, Stephen, is we expect JT and jack-sawyer to play 90% of the snaps at defensive end in 2023 and do so as dominating forces. So they're here. They've played. We think they will continue to play a lot. But I'm not sure they are, at this point in their careers, the players that we thought they might be, at least the way we were talking about back then. Because I don't know that anybody in the country necessarily thinks that, especially jack-sawyer, who just didn't play as much this year. People aren't saying, oh, Ohio State has two of the three best defensive players in the country heading into the season. That's not where we are. We set a very high bar, so we're not saying guys are disappointing. But one thing I want to make very clear here, when we did this podcast in July of 2021, could this be a college football powerhouse, one of the great teams in college football history? It was Quinn Ewers influenced, also the skill guys on offense. But having listened back to this, Stephen, there was a lot that we were putting on the defense because we thought potentially they're going to line up 11 guys on defense who were all top 50 national recruits. But we put a lot on JT and jack-sawyer. And now that we're actually here, what do we think of those two guys heading into their junior seasons?
Well, I'm going to tackle this in parts. The 90% of the snaps part is probably going to happen. You're probably sprinkling some Caden Curry and, somebody, but especially Caden Curry is probably going to be the third guy there. But I would not be as shocked if 90% of the meaningful snaps go to these two guys. So that we're not that far off with those guys. I think JT is headed in that direction. I mean, that Penn State game was whoa, and it feels like he said, now, can he start getting home more? That's the real question there. While with Jack, it might be a sentiment of just that dude had to start learning a whole new position last year that he may or may not be best fit to play. He might just be best at go get the quarterback, which is fine as long as you're also being able to stop the run. But that Jack position, I feel like it might have thrown off his development a little bit as a traditional defensive end. But at the same time, Doug, you would know this better than I do because you do a national podcast as well. I don't know who the best returning defensive player is in the country, just off the top of my head. So these guys are going to play a lot of football. And if you tell me in November that JT is the best defensive player in the country and jack-sawyer is an all Big Ten level defensive end and borderline All-American, I'm not going to bat an eye at it if you say that right now, just because there are a lot of really good defensive players who are draft eligible and they win.
Yeah, Dallas Turner in Alabama is probably a guy who maybe was slightly lower rated than these two Ohio State guys, but might be thought of a little bit higher right now.
The top 5 defensive players from that 21 class: Corey Foreman, jt-tuimoloau, jack-sawyer, Dallas Turner right there, and then Leonard Taylor at Miami closes out that list. So right now, Dallas Turner is probably the closest thing to living up to that top 10 player in the country status because Corey Foreman hasn't been blowing things off the map at USC right now.
So, like one of the things, like I said, Nathan, you had said some 2022 guy in the depth chart at defensive end, and like Caden Curry fits that. Kenyatta Jackson might fix that. There are a couple guys who might fit that. But the way we were thinking when we are doing something outrageous, like how good this team might be, we're not thinking that jack-sawyer and jt-tuimoloau are going to be good. We're thinking they're going to be the next Chase Young and Joey Bosa and Nick Bosa and Tyquan Lewis and Sam Hubbard and all those things. And again, nobody is saying that they are not living up to expectations. But JT has the Penn State game, and then I think there's a lot of he's effective. You got to double team him. He's getting some pressures, right? But that's like the one game that he sort of blew up. And even in that, some of them are tip balls up the line. He certainly had the one strip sack, but it's not Chase Young level. And we can't hold everybody to that. But I will tell you, Nathan, in July 2021, that's kind of how we were talking. So if we're talking about what the peak of a 2023 Ohio State team could be, in July of 2021, we were talking about it like 2 All-American defensive ends, and what a place to start. And so if this team in 2023 is going to maximize what it can be, and this might be the best team in college football in 2023. It very well might be. It still kind of has to maybe not start there because it probably starts with Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka. But those guys have to be great. Defensively, it might have to start there, right, with the defensive ends?
I think it does, yeah. I think that's the difference maker because we've already seen that Ohio State putting up a lot of passing and receiving yards does not necessarily equate a national championship. We saw it in 2020. We saw it in 2021 for a team that couldn't even get to the playoff. We saw it last season for a team that's right there. I mean, that's the one that's maybe almost unfair, but it came with progress on defense, not a seismic shift, but progress on defense. And it's not fair to compare people to Chase Young, a generational player necessarily. But we know what we're talking about here. You felt jt-tuimoloau in that Penn State game in a way that we had not felt an Ohio State edge rusher since Chase Young. Like you felt it like all the way through. And Ohio State has, I would say, pretty consistently since Chase Young left, had defensive ends that opposing fan bases and or coaches respect. Like you respected Jonathan Cooper. He came out and played really hard and was productive for his level. And Zach Harrison, a guy that you would come out and was a all Big Ten kind of player. And I think you respected what he did on a football field, but you didn't fear those guys. Like there needs to be a renewed element of fear from that defensive end, from the edge rushers at Ohio State. And I don't think that means that literally the other team is like quaking in its boots. It's more about the feel that you get. Like when those guys are on a football field, do you feel them? And there were too many times this past season where both Tuimoloau and Sawyer were, I think, productive, but the Ohio State needs that next level. I don't think that's asking them to do something otherworldly. I don't think it's asking them to do something that's outside of their abilities or what is the ceiling of their abilities. It's again just how we compare Ohio State to itself. When Ohio State has been a national championship caliber team and a great team, it often has those guys coming off the edge, and we're just asked. I think it's reasonable for people to expect that to happen again. But this group this year is a really interesting one because it's those 2 guys at the top, and as we'll talk about, then 3 guys from last year's class that all have some upside, and it's just a matter of how that rotation works itself out. Does somebody like a Caden Curry, Omari Abor, Kenyatta Jackson, who forces their way into the conversation more?
They lost Zach Harrison out of that group. And they lost Javonte Jean-Baptiste, who transferred to Notre Dame, which will be interesting. Will they be better at defensive end in 2023 than in 2022? Or will they miss Zach Harrison? Or do you think if we're getting peak JT and Jack, peak of them, and then here come those 3 second-year guys, could this be a somewhat significant step up from what was, I think, in the end, a pretty solid, sometimes better than solid defensive end group in 2022, Stephen? Is that the expectation? Is that the possibility?
I think it's possible because even with what Zach did this past season, I don't know if he surpassed expectations for what he is as he's a very good football player, and that's what he was this year, a very good football player. JT took the leap in year 2, even if it wasn't, I'm going to go get 8.5 sacks. He did enough stuff there to show, okay, he's headed in the right direction here. So now it's just a matter of, can Jack do the same if they let him just be a defensive end? And so you have some promise there while also seeing enough of a flash from Caden Curry to believe that maybe he's headed on a trajectory as well. Now we just have to see what Kenyatta and Amari, because Abor spent the year hurt and we just didn't see a lot from Jackson.
What do you think, Nathan? Is better? Excellent defensive end play very realistic in your mind?
I think it's realistic, sure, but I think it isn't the assumption. Kind of like what Steven's saying. I think both these guys still have to take that next step. And now Sawyer is an interesting case because he was asked to do something last year that was a change for him. The time that he spent playing the jack, and that wasn't a staple of the defense in a way that we thought it might be. It wasn't like every other series. It was more of a niche thing within this defense. So I'm curious, does he do that more in 2023? Does he play more of a conventional edge rusher and still do jack stuff? Do they use Caden Curry as the jack and let jack-sawyer be more of the conventional edge rusher? Like, what is that? How does that part of the defense grow, or does it grow? There are still some unknowns there, because there's a reason Jim Knowles used Sawyer there and wanted him on the field in that role, but it was also within the balance, as we talked about a lot going into that year. Well, how are they going to get all three of these guys involved as much as possible, with Harrison included? And now Harrison's taken out of the mix. And you seem to, as much as Caden Curry flashed some good things last year, there clearly seems to be a top two here. So are you worried more about just getting those top two on the field as much as possible? And does that mean you pull back on the jack usage? Or did you see enough of a foundation from that, if you're Jim Knowles, that you want to go into it kind of take it to the next level? Because that's what he's been talking about this whole time, was that it was sort of a position in development and something that could grow in terms of the responsibilities that they give jack-sawyer and how productive he could be with it.
Just as an example, I'm looking on PFF at the edge rushers who had the most pressures in this last season. Will Anderson, as an edge rusher for Alabama, he was second in the nation with 59 pressures among edge guys. He played 652 snaps. Jt-Tuimoloau from USC, who was an All-American, he had 49 pressures. He played 621 snaps. KJ Henry had the most pressures for Clemson. He played 561 snaps. When you look at the Ohio State guys, Zach Harrison had the most pressures among edge guys. He had 31. JT had 30. But Zach Harrison played 435 snaps. JT played 453. So they each played 200 fewer snaps individually than Will Anderson did. So then they had, 30 fewer pressures or 28 fewer pressures. But if we're talking about, could you play them more? Could you play JT and Jack more? Well, like we're talking about these All-American guys who basically didn't come off the field. Will Anderson wasn't in a rotation, right? They didn't. So I think the three-man rotation made a lot of sense for what they did this year. But if we're asking, could it be a heavy dose of JT and Jack as your two best guys in 2023? And what would that mean from an individual production standpoint, which is nice, but what it really means is how much better might it make your defense, Stephen? Jim Knowles says he likes to play. Now, Larry Johnson is in charge of the defensive line, and he likes to rotate. Jim Knowles is in charge of everybody else, and he says he kind of likes to go with his main guys. I'll be curious how that works out. But, Stephen, it's not like edge rushers only play 450 snaps a year. These guys could play 650, and maybe they should.
I just looked at Chase Young's, and mind you, this is also why he missed 2 games. So you take that into account. He played 576, so he would have been well over 600, maybe even over 650 in 2019 when he had 16 and a half sacks. So that's part of with the Will Anderson and stuff and all those other guys you just named is, yeah, they get the numbers, but they're also on the field long enough to get the numbers. Like sacks you got to play you accumulate a lot of snaps if you're going to get that many sacks. And I'm not saying that if you play JT 600 snaps, he's going to have 18 sacks next year, but you want a 10-sack guy, put him in the best position to get 10 sacks. And that means keep him on the field. And it does feel like this, just like in 2019, where there was kind of Chase Young, a really, really young Zach Harrison, a Tyreek Smith who couldn't stay healthy, and then basically a lot of, but even then unproven. It was Chase Young as like ready to go, and a lot of young guys who hadn't proven themselves. So Chase, you're not coming off the field, and everybody else rotates. Well, now you've got 2 of those guys potentially. So, where it's set up in a way where they're juniors, nobody else is proven. You don't necessarily have to take JT and Jack off the field.
Just among Power 5 edge rushers last year, more than 65 guys played at least 500 snaps. So that's normal. And no Ohio State guys played more than 450. Mm-hmm. So it's putting a lot on them. They've been good football players, at times great football players. If Ohio State's going to be a great team, they probably need the defensive ends to be great almost all the time. So that's what we projected about that. And that's the thing that we were the most correct about was anticipating a lot from JT and Jack in 2023. Anybody could have done that. Defensive tackle, I will say, we ended up, like in our defensive line conversations, Nathan, we ended up saying, okay, like Mike Hall, him, actually kind of lump him in with Jack and JT, that they should have 3 sure things by 2023. And I'm not sure we would have moved off that by now. We then talked a lot about Ty Hamilton as the second defensive tackle in 2023. We talked about Tyleik Williams. We also mentioned some Jaden McKenzie. But Mike Hall, Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams, pretty good. And, like, I think pretty good. What's your defensive tackle depth chart right now as it stands in the actual year of 2023, and what do you think of it?
So I had as the starters Mike Hall and Ty Hamilton. Now, Ty Hamilton was starting over Mike Hall down the stretch last year. How much of that was the injuries, the shoulder stuff that Mike Hall was dealing with? How much was it the coaching staff just deciding that Hamilton was the guy that needed to start as an all-around player? I don't know that that's ever completely been sussed out. And they obviously also had Teron Vincent, who is gone. So you're filling one starting spot among those 2 defensive tackles. So those are the 2 I had in as starters. And then with Tyleik Williams and Hero Kanu as the backup guys. Hero Kanu, I elevated maybe over whoever else could be in that rotation just because he's just huge. I've seen him a couple times just walking around, and he's just a mountain of a guy. And those guys always intrigue you. And Ohio State has now a handful of these guys who are, they do a good job penetrating. I think that's Mike Hall's calling card. That's Tyleik Williams' calling card, getting in the backfield. So they could probably use maybe just a big mountain of a guy to balance that out a little bit.
So in the end, like, got what they need? Steven, you think they got what they needed defensive tackle to be really good in 2023?
Yeah, I like the progression that if Ty Hamilton's on. He's actually probably a year ahead of his brother Davon was, and he's always kind of been moving along maybe 12 months earlier than Davon was able to get onto the field. And then, I mean, if they're going to let Mike Hall actually play, I mean, we just had this conversation with the defensive ends. Let's have it with Mike Hall. If they're going to let that guy actually play snaps, then maybe he can be more disruptive, and maybe we see the numbers. And Tyleik Williams seems to be in better shape, and he made some big plays, especially in that Penn State game. He made some plays in that game. And so I think those 3 are clearly your top 3. Is Hero Kanu be Tommy Togiai-ish? Because he is huge and he is all types of strong. Can he be that as a year 2 guy, just like Tommy Togiai was like in that rotation in 2019 as a year 2 guy? Can he be that type of nose tackle for Ohio State? That's a pretty quality quartet. And then, I mean, I know he likes to go 6 deep. Larry Johnson does in there. So maybe Jaden McKenzie as a now 5th-year guy gets into that rotation, and there's a spot for one more guy. But that top 4 seems pretty, especially that top 3 seems pretty solidified at this point.
So when we were talking about this and projecting it, we really were, as you do always, you're really leaning on the 3rd-year guys, right? That's why you do something like this. Everybody was excited about Ohio State's 2021 recruiting class. So then you say, hey, how good they got to do when all these guys are 3rd-year guys. But when we were talking about it, it was like, okay, there's going to be some like electric 3rd-year guys offensively, but there on defense, there's going to be 3rd-year guys, but there's going to be some 4th-year guys that they need to kind of hang around and be important, and they maybe need to fill in with some 2022 guys. I do think, Nathan, and you've mentioned a couple of these guys, but you think about Hero Kanu, Caden Curry, Amari Abor, and Kenyatta Jackson. Those are 4 guys who are going to be 2nd-year guys on this defensive line in 2023, who were all in the top 129 overall players in their group. So if we're talking about Sawyer, JT, Hall, and Hamilton, and Tyleik Williams off the top, and then, all right, here's some 2nd-year guys who you can rotate. This feels like it really, there's a top end to this defensive line, but there's some talented depth to this too, that it feels like there is reason from a variety of angles to feel good about where the Buckeyes are here.
Yeah, again, comparing it to the conversation we had about the offensive line, it's not where you're asking a bunch of developmental guys to make a big jump and maybe play far above their expectations. Like when you're signing guys in that like 125, 150 range, maybe you're not looking at those guys as being immediate impact, and maybe you're not looking at those guys as a superstar ceiling, but that's you're recruiting starters from that range. Like those are all guys who you think are going to start for you someday, I think. And it's a natural progression of a career for guys like that, and be really good players and be potential NFL players at the end of 4 years later. And so this defensive line, I know there's a lot of talk out there about, the direction Larry Johnson's going in and coming up on the end for him, which is the conversation that's been going on since I think before I got here, and we're going into my, fifth season covering this team. But they've set things up pretty well from just a baseline of talent for this next season. And then there's maybe a question, because this is actually a pretty big bridge season, especially for that defensive end group. I know we've kind of jumped ahead to talking to about the tackles, but if Tuimoloau and Sawyer, like back in 2021, we were certainly talking about those guys as being ready to play their third and final year for Ohio State in 2023. So if those guys move on, now you've got Curry, Jackson, and Abor. Now it's huge, like what they have to be in 2024. And you start talking about Mike Hall's going into his third year, like and Ty Hamilton be going in his fourth year. And so now you start peeling potentially starters out of this group. So I think it's both kind of a potential boom year for this defensive line, but what's going on underneath it, the development that's happening underneath it. And it's probably critical that you see someone, even though, yes, it makes perfect sense that Tuimoloau and Sawyer play a ton of snaps. I think it might be kind of crucial that somebody from those other three, and we think it probably would be Caden Curry from what he showed last year, but somebody from that group maybe steps up and is like, no, you guys have to put me on the field. Like, I'm demanding it with my play, because that guy's going to have to be huge in 2024. And I don't think you want to wait till 2024 to find out he's got.
Okay. That discussion made sense. It was players that we've heard of playing positions that still exist, which is not necessarily how the rest of this podcast is going to go. We'll start talking about the B word after this on Buckeye Talk.